Hey, so welcome to another episode of the Anagoge podcast. And today I have Jonathan Pageau. He's from Canada. He's a carver, and he has a pretty popular YouTube channel. How big is it now, Jonathan? Because I remember you being quite small, like, I don't know, 5K or something.
It's about 80,000 subscribers,
Awesome.
but I would say there's about 10,000 people that follow me really attentively. Some of the stuff is complicated too. It's not like popular. How can I say this? It's not like all the other YouTube channels, because we don't talk. We try to address some difficult subjects. So
Right. And so what his YouTube channel is about is mostly exploring religious symbolism, and he's a Christian, and so he comes from that perspective. And I found it incredibly valuable in order to understand myself better, understand the world better. And I've studied a fair bit of philosophy, psychology, stuff like that. And so I've seen a lot of thinkers that influenced me, but it's one thing to influence me just intellectually. But Jonathan is among a very restricted group that not only has influenced me intellectually, but also has had a deep impact in my life. And I would like to that impact to spread. And that's also part why I'm trying to share his ideas a bit better. And so, Jonathan, part of what I'm trying to achieve with this conversation is maybe an introduction to the topic of symbolism. And I would like to try to make it friendly to, like, if Dawkins was watching, someone that's not only, let's say that they're not 100% hostile to religion, because those are a bit lost cases, but let's say that they're not interested, the typical materialists scientific view. So that's, I think, a lot of what's my audience is, and especially my audience in terms of more immediate social circles. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to break and hopefully put something there. So something, before we get a bit more deep into symbolism, something that I'm very interested in is, I know almost nothing about your personal life when you were younger. And I know that you mentioned that you lived, I believe, in South Africa for a while. But I would like to know a bit on two different ends. One is on your carving. How did you get started? How did you get into this artistic and carving career? And also your religious views. How did they change over time? Because I know that you converted to Orthodoxy, but I don't know if your symbolic view was there all along, if there was a major shift, if you were always a Christian. So if you could maybe give some background, that would be great.
So I grew up, my parents converted in Quebec, where I am. It was probably one of the most Catholic places in the world, let's say around World War II. And then in the 1960s, there was, just like everywhere else in the world, there was a kind of, they call it the Quiet Revolution, where everything started to change. Secular ideas started to flood in. And one of the things that happened was a mass exodus out of the Catholic Church. And some people left the Catholic Church and just became secular or whatever. And some people had a more, like my parents, they converted to evangelical Protestantism. And for them, it was really a journey towards more experiential Christianity, where they felt like the Catholic Church was stifling and was also, and the priests were also ignorant. They didn't study very much. My dad would chase priests down the street with a Bible trying to get answers from them, but they didn't have any answers for him. And so he felt like the Protestants were giving him the answers that he needed. And so my parents both converted to this kind of evangelical Protestantism. And my father became a Baptist minister. So my father was a pastor when I was younger. And he was a pastor until I was about 13. And then we moved around. I lived in the US for a while my dad was studying. And so, I kind of experienced different things. And then in my 20s, just like many people in their 20s, I started to read and to read more philosophical authors, and to ask questions, to read also texts from other traditions, and to wonder about, the Protestant faith that I was in. And I felt mostly that the churches where I grew up, although the people were great and I didn't have any problem with them, the people were wonderful and really dedicated Christians, I felt like they didn't have enough in terms of their intellectual perspective, and that they just didn't have answers to the problems that I was seeing in modern philosophy. I didn't feel like the problem of creationism was answering the challenge of science. I didn't feel all of these things were not jiving with me. And so then I started to read other traditions, started to read other religious texts, started to look around to search. And that's when I discovered some symbolic thinkers who weren't necessarily Christian at first. So René Guénon, who is a perennialist, and Mircea Eliade, that kind of writer, Ananda Coomaraswamy, who were writing about tradition, in a modern way and trying to help people understand the value of traditional thought. And that really helped me. Like, it really broke my modernist mind, and it broke my modern fetishism, you could call it, and kind of led me down the road. And all of this was happening also with my brother, Mathieu, who you might know, recently wrote a book on symbolism called The Language of Creation. And we were kind of doing this together. So my brother started reading the same authors I was reading then also rabbinical texts. And then I started reading the church fathers more so, and discovered St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Maximus the Confessor, all these early church fathers that really seem to have a very different perspective on reality and how the world kind of laid itself out. And that ultimately, and at the same time, I was studying art in school, and I was going through a crisis in terms of my own spirituality, but also a crisis in terms of my art, because contemporary art is a very cynical world. It's a very cynical, sarcastic, kind of ironic world, very detached. And I just couldn't find my place there, because I knew I was a Christian, even though I was doubting some things. I knew that I was a Christian. And, my teacher, I remember, because I was trying to kind of wrestle with these ideas in my art, kind of my Christianity and my place in the world and all of these things. And one of my main teachers at the end of my degree told me, like, what are you doing here? This is not a place for you. You should go to seminary or something. And so then all through that, I discovered iconography, which is really the traditional language, visual language that Christianity developed in the first, 1,200 years. And I discovered in there a very powerful language, a very powerful visual language of symbolism. And all of that led me to Orthodoxy, where most of that language was still alive in terms of the art, in terms of the liturgy, in terms of their attachment to the church fathers. And then finally I ended up converting to Eastern Orthodoxy.
So you actually got into symbolic thinking after you're already pretty entrenched in art and craving, right? And then you just kind of...
Well, it was mostly a solution. It was a solution to my problem in terms of art. While I was studying art in school, I was working in the contemporary art world, but I was basically trying to find or create a symbolic language. I was attracted to some contemporary artists like Anselm Kiefer, who let's say are doing that to a certain degree and are kind of using symbolic tropes in their work. But it just wasn't working. Sorry, it just wasn't coming together. But then when I discovered the language of the church and the traditional language of the Christian tradition, I really felt like I'd found a treasure, and that there was so much there. And at first I was disappointed because I felt like this language kind of went away during the Renaissance and the Baroque and all the modern and the move towards the modern art. But and so I was kind of sad because I would go to the library and study all these medieval manuscripts and look at ancient images and ancient frescoes and stuff. Until I discovered that in the Orthodox Church, that tradition was still alive. It had suffered, but it was still there and it was still recognized by the church. And so that was also one of the reasons why I ended up converting to Orthodoxy. So symbolism came first. Like, symbolism came before I ended up converting. Just having these insights about reality and having these insights about image making and the place of culture and all of these things is what finally led me to seeing the Orthodox Church as being the last place in the West where this was still possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, something that I've noticed is that you're incredibly well read, but it's not easy to tell. Like you're very philosophically and historically literate, but you don't show it very often. It kind of goes indirectly. Like you don't appeal to it very often because you're trying to, and I think that's very good. You're trying to ground it in everyday experience without trying to use too much jargon. But I've noticed, especially when John Verreke was involved, that you can go to a whole other level that at first traumatized me a bit. I was like, what the hell is he talking about?
Okay, what is he talking about?
Yeah, this is not the Jonathan I know. Like, just bring me my basic phenomenology, and I don't want
that's true. You're right in the sense that I really try in my videos to speak at a level that most people can understand because I believe that the intuitions that symbolism bring are real. Like anybody can have them. The dumbest or the smartest person, everybody can have these intuitions by kind of seeing the connection of things in the world. And I also, like you said, if you read my brother's book, for example, he doesn't quote anybody in the entire book, which really frustrated many people. Like a lot of university students wrote me and said, your brother doesn't quote anybody. I can't use him in my classes because he doesn't have his sources. But we're also trying to create a different type of, we're trying to bring back a more ancient version of understanding. I mean, Plato didn't quote people. Aristotle, they didn't quote people, and they didn't quote people just as authorities. They quoted people if it was useful to them, but they were mostly trying to get to the bottom of reality and how reality works. And reality doesn't work through a series of quotes. It works through within our experience of the world. But like you said, if I need to, then I can also access that, if I'm talking to someone who is speaking in that language or using more philosophical terms.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned already two figures, which I remember them, but my English is not that great, so I can't quote their names. But I'm wondering if there's figures that really influence besides the two that you mentioned, but that are more recent. So let's say 20th century plus in terms of philosophy, because most of the ones that I've seen you mentioned are like early church fathers, which makes sense. But I'm wondering if there's some more modern thinkers, especially if they're secular, that really influence your thought.
That are secular? That's harder. That's a harder one.
Let's just say in general then. I don't want to make it too hard.
I would, in the modern, let's say, I really, like I said, I mentioned René Guénon, who's a French writer. He's early 20th century, but he's an anti-modern. He's a traditionalist. And so he really tries to help people understand traditional thinking. He has his problems. He has some very serious problems in terms of, let's say, some of his tendencies and stuff. Like I tend to always recommend him with a serious caveat because he has some weirdness to him. But let's say in the 20th century, Heidegger, for sure, I'm influenced by Heidegger. And I'm also influenced by postmodern thinkers. I'm influenced by Jacques Derrida, and I'm influenced by some of the later semioticians like Roland Barthes has influenced me. And people are surprised when I say that because they're so radical. But I feel like there's something about in the postmodern thinking, which is actually a return to symbolism, but they're doing it in an inverted way. They're doing it in an upside down manner. You see that also in kind of post-critical theory, in kind of even in gender theory and in race theory, kind of these new theories. You see that they use a lot of symbolic thinking, but they do it upside down. Mm-hmm. And so you can still get something from what they're saying if you just turn it back right side up. And Jacques Derrida is a wonderful place to understand how the margin affects the center, how how the indefinite things on the edge, how the supplements, how these hybrid figures that exist on the edge of being, how they can actually devour being, and they can start to destabilize the systems that the regular beings, let's say, inhabit. And so they can be very helpful to help you understand, and even to help you understand how to resist that. So I would say those are some of the thinkers. In terms of, I would say Vladimir Lossky, who is a Orthodox theologian, has definitely influenced me quite a bit. Leonid Uspensky, who is kind of one of the people who rediscovered iconography in the 20th century, his writings has also influenced me quite a bit. Recently, René Girard has been popping up I've noticed that I mention him more than, as I see these new religious things appearing in America, and I see this scapegoating, come about again. I tend to reference René Girard a little more. So I would say those are the ones that I'm interested. But one of the things that I've run into, people are annoyed, is that a lot of modern semiotics and much of modern interpretation schemes I find are just bogus. They're just not interesting. And I'm actually very much fighting them. Like, my manner of dealing with the Bible is against all the modern biblical scholars. I find the modern biblical scholars to be a cancer on religious experience.
It's quite odd because, like, they take a very hyper historical, hyper political view of it, and it's so hard. And I think there's a value on it, and I think maybe you'll disagree a bit with me, because I think when narratives pass down through time, I think there's a risk of them losing their original meaning, and then we have to reconstruct by it, and our reconstruction will be incomplete because we don't know exactly what they're thinking. And because they live in a social, historical, political context, that's likely entrenched somewhere in the stories. Now, I think it's incredibly reductivist to reduce it to that, but it's there. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on it. But it's so bizarre that that's all they see. And a lot of them, they're Christians. Like, I understand from an atheist, but not from a Christian.
They're Christians who don't see how they're destroying their own religion. The thing, this is somewhere where postmodernism, I think, has given me some fuel, you could say, which is that you cannot take out of the text the relevance that this text has to us. Like, you cannot take that out. And so there's a reason why it has remained in our attention for thousands of years, and that it continues to be part of our discourse. And that reason cannot be limited to the historical contingency of this or that narrative, to this king or that king, or whether or not this figure that's mentioned here exists, or is an amalgamation of different figures, or blah 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 blah. Whether or not this name or this figure comes from Egypt or from Akkadian culture or whatever, like, that doesn't account for the reason why we remember these stories and why we care about them. Because there are plenty of texts that existed in that time that people forgot about. Most texts people forgot about. This text we didn't forget about. And so we need to account for the reason why we remember them and why we care about them. And to me, not only should we need to account for that, but that is the most important. The reason why you telling me that Moses never existed for this or that reason is more important. And the reason why you think that's important and why you're going to make a lot of money by telling me that Moses never existed is more important than you telling me that. And the reason is because that text has primal importance in our culture. That text has the hearts and minds of millions of people, and it has been remembered and has become our story. So that's way more important than what you're telling me. And I mean, I'll take what you tell me. That's fine. Like I can take some of it and I can listen to it, knowing that scientific theories will change no matter what. They'll find some other thing in the desert in 10 years and that'll change the whole thing. You know, I can take what you're saying me, but the other aspect is way more important.
Right.
And like I said, not only is it more important, but it even justifies you telling me this, like, because you're not writing books, bestseller books, telling me about some ancient goddess and how they misunderstood this ancient goddess. And you know, like, it's funny you're not writing bestseller books about that. Why not? Because no one cares about that. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I always fall in random mode.
No worries. But yeah, that's a very good point. You mentioned Plato and Aristotle, which is funny because that's something I wanted to get into as well, because something that I found in trying to people reframe religion is to kind of expose the philosophy in a more explicit manner. Because then, in my experience, and I can tell this from my own perspective as well, that immediately gets some respect from it, and it kind of transcends the binary reception that people have to religion, which is like there's X claim, and this X claim is either scientifically accurate or inaccurate. And so if you look through religion through that lens, like you're just not going to find very much. But if you force people to think a bit more philosophically, then people start to, they're forced to think about it. They can't just say, oh, that's superstition. Like there's actually serious problems that you need to think about. And I'm curious about how Christianity took from the Platonic tradition and from Aristotle, from the potential and the essences and stuff like that. I can see it very clearly with Plato especially, but Aristotle I'm less familiar, except like a pop introduction. So if you could elaborate on that, I think that would be helpful.
Well, the first thing to mention, and the first thing that's important to mention is that Plato and Aristotle do not exist in a vacuum. They didn't just come up with their thing. And even in their own text, and even in the text of the Neoplatonists especially, they refer that a lot of their wisdom came from other places, came from the East, came from India. And so we tend to we have this weird idea that Plato just came up with this stuff, like out of his own thinking. He was, you know, even if you read Plato's text, he talks about being initiated. He talks about, you know, he might've been a Pythagorean initiate. And around Greece, there were the Pythagoreans who were in contact with Vedantic scholars and with people from the East. And so this weird idea of that Plato just exists is just not just his idea just kind of came out of his thinking is baloney, first of all. And that's really important to understand, right? It's important to understand that there are analogies in Platonism with other traditional thought, with thought from Vedanta and India, with thought from even what we find in the Bible, right? That there are analogies that are there. And it's not just that one influenced the other. It's that both of them are trying to express some aspects of reality and are doing it in conversation with each other. It's just weird how people understand how the ancient world existed. You know, the letters of the Greek alphabet were Phoenician. They had lost their own writing and they had to borrow Semitic letters in order to re-establish their own writing. And so the idea that there's no relationship between Semitic thought and Platonic thought is so patently absurd. They were in constant contact with each other. Intellectuals were constantly engaging with each other's thought. Anyways, so that's one thing. And so second of all, you can, like I said, one of the things that let's say Platonic and Aristotelian thought did was give Christianity in Greek words that they could use to express these patterns and to talk about reality. And so the Neoplatonists, especially the Neoplatonists, they had found ways also to synthesize some of Plato's and Aristotle's ideas. And they were able to find words, and we use those words in the Christian tradition. When we talk about, for example, when we use the word homoousion, when we say that that the son is of the same nature as the father, let's say. We're using words that are from Greek philosophy. When we talk about logos, we're using words from Greek philosophy. But the notion of logos didn't come from Plato. That is insane to think that. Right? It is insane to think that. There are analogies to the notion of logos in Chinese culture, in Indian culture, in every culture, because it's a representation of how reality manifests itself. Right? And how there are principles in reality that manifest. You can see, it's like when you look at something as a human person, you can see the thing, but you can see the pattern in the thing, right? Why is it that you know that a chair is a chair? And how is it that you know that all the different chairs participate in the same pattern of chair? We notice that. Why do we think that two chairs are the same thing? They're two objects, but we say both of them, we name them chair, and they're different from each other. They're not the same. One can be blue, one can be bigger, one can be small, one can have, but we all use the same name, chair. And so there's a pattern there. There's a pattern which is, we use the word above, but it's just it's an image. There's a pattern which is beyond the particular manifestations. And that's what Plato was noticing. He's like, there has to be these essences that are above things, because how could I know that the things are things? And how could I differentiate things if there weren't patterns that help me to do that? And like I said, how can I say that Athens is something? Like, how can I name that? How can I name a city? It's a million things. It's buildings and people and all kinds of stuff and a constitution and laws and blah, blah, blah. But nonetheless, I'm able to pull away from that and to say Athens. I name it like a mass of millions of details. I'm able to name into one name, one essence. Okay. And so he notices that. And the problem is how to work it out so that we can, to help us understand how that works. And so Plato and Aristotle both trying to propose their solution. Plato said that there are these essences, these eternal patterns that are above the world, that are, let's say, before the world, and now the world is manifesting those patterns, right? If there weren't patterns, then like I said, if there wasn't an aspect of what Plato said was true, then how do we even know that? How do we engage with the world? Like, how do we know things exist? Especially things that are more abstract. It's like, how do I recognize virtue? Or how do I recognize pride? So I have all these people, millions of people who have behaviors, and then all of a sudden I can say, oh, that's pride. And I can recognize it across different peoples and across time. And I say that has a being. And then I can name it. It's pride. It's a pattern of being, right? So there has to be these patterns somehow. Now the problem is, like, what is this? Where are they? So Aristotle, his solution was to say, it's not that these patterns exist independently, like that they exist somewhere, whatever that means, but rather that they exist only in their instantiation. So he tended to focus mostly on the instantiation of the pattern. And so that they exist in their instantiation, but there's a tension there between emphasizing the instantiation, the body, you could say, and then emphasizing the essence, right? And then if you want to know, that's all of philosophy, basically. It's the whole problem of philosophy, right? And so what Christianity does is that Christianity balances it out in what you could call incarnational thinking, which is that it's not like Plato, where we think that the essences are outside of the world. And what you need to do is to get out of the world, right? And so that's the allegory of the cave, right? You're sitting, everything you see, everything you experience is an illusion. It's a pale reflection of actual reality. So you need to escape the world in order to have an experience of the pure patterns, of the pure ideas, okay? So that's what Plato was advocating. But let's say the Christian perception is that those shadows are not shadows. They're the instantiations of that pattern. The things in the world are filled up with logos. Without logos, they don't exist. Without essence, things don't exist. They scatter into quantum potential. Let's use a modern world. They scatter down into potentiality. They don't cohere. You need these patterns. But then when we get the sense, when we encounter a being, that's the instantiation of the pattern. So it's not a negative perception of reality. It's not a negative perception of the world. It's a positive perception of the world. Because the only place where you can encounter the patterns are in their instantiations. And the reason why the patterns exist are to be incarnated. Right? There's no purpose of having an ideal chair without actual chairs.
Right.
What's the point of having a heavenly pattern of a chair without chairs you can sit on? And so that's the compromise that Christianity gives. It's the incarnational principle, you could say.
And would you say that synthesis was present in the very early church based on the narrative of Christ, or was that a more modern interpretation after Aquinas tried to kind of put Aristotle back into theology? Was that there all along?
There's no need Aquinas for that at all. Like, it's already there in Athanasius. It's there right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. If you read Saint Irenaeus, you already have that. If you read the very, very early church fathers, you already have this notion. But one of the things that Christianity does as well, and that's something people don't understand, is that because it is incarnational, because what it's proposing is incarnational, the manner in which it proposes it is incarnational as well. So Christianity is not a bunch of theories about reality. Mm-hmm. Christianity is a mode of being. It's a way of living your life. It's a way of existing in the world. It's a connection to a story, but a story that you live in. So it's not me sitting in my couch thinking about Christianity and thinking about, how this solves Plato's problem of this or that. That's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be, this is how you live in the world to fully realize what this is about, like what incarnational existence is about. And so the solution that Christians give is love. They say, love, that's how the world exists.
Right. That's actually something that took me quite a while to realize, and you helped me a lot of this participatory modes of being that is emphasized in Christianity. But part of the problem about that way of being is that you can't commit to the way of being if you don't believe in it. And it's hard to believe in it if you don't understand it. And so it helps to kind of deconstruct the value of the story so that people can participate in the story.
No, I agree. And that's why I do what I do, because also I think that, let's say, the type of person that I'm talking to is usually a slightly more intellectual type person, someone who studied in college or whatever, And so for a simple person, let's say for my aunt or my grandmother or whatever, they don't need as much. They have this experience and they experience, let's say, the story, and they kind of, and then it's enough for them. But it's true that for a lot of more intellectual type people, they have a barrier, which is their own understanding. And they think, and also my aunt is a barrier to that person, because they see my aunt, they see she's stupid, and they think, well, I'm not like her, and I'm not going to accept the things that stupid people accept. Right. And so that's a barrier. And so that it's true that that's one of the barriers I'm trying to break, is to help people see that, just because your aunt doesn't understand the full mystery of Christianity doesn't mean it's not there. You just have to look at to the right people to find the working out of these issues in a more profound manner. Right.
Something that I would like you to explore is, how does Christianity view other religions? Because when I'm thinking about Christianity and trying to embody Christianity, I'm not at the level where I can accept it and act it fully without processing it. And I don't want, and it seems to me that there's things that are incredibly valued, but there's things to me that don't make as much sense. And I can't truthfully act them out when I don't see that they make sense. And so there's a tiny gap in the system that I can't incorporate. And something that has helped me a lot to try to have more trust in things that don't make sense is when I notice the same pattern across very different cultures. And so that's what a lot of people try to do with perennialism, for example. And I think that helped me a lot, and I think that helps a lot of people. But at the same time, I don't want to get into the Huxley mode of just like crunching everything together. They're all a single theology and whatever. And I also don't want to have like the modern liberal tendency of just like equalizing everything so that I don't have a hierarchy. But so there's these two tensions, and I'm trying to balance the two. And I'm curious about how Christianity deals with this. Like what is Buddhism to Christianity? Like what is Hinduism and so forth?
Yeah. It depends. Christianity doesn't have one answer to that. It just depends on who you read and also what purpose the person writing is writing for, right? Who are they talking to and what are they saying? Let's say it this way. The desire to know what Christians think of other religions, for example, or the desire to make that okay, because it's a pressure right now. It's a pressure, a social pressure, that you say that every other religion is okay, right? And it's an intellectual pressure. It's almost like if you don't do that, then you're a pariah, like you're a zealot or whatever. Okay, now that's something. That is an actual social manifestation of something, and it's a social manifestation of a breakdown of identities and a breakdown of particular paths. Because the thing is that when you walk on a path, the person who comes to you and asks you if the other paths would lead to the same place, what is that person doing? What are you doing? I'm walking on a path. And then you come to me and you ask, well, what about this other path on the other side of the hill? Don't you think that path would also reach to the top of the mountain? Why do you feel like you have to walk on this path? Aren't all paths the same? And it's like, that person is your enemy. Like that person is not going to go anywhere, seriously, because they're not on a path. You need to be on a path, and you can't make it up as you go along. And so there's a danger in asking that question, in the sense that there's if that question you ask me is done in a kind of political desire to be okay with the liberal order, let's say, like to be okay with society. So like, at least I'll be accepted by my friends if I at least say that I think that other religions are okay. So I can be a Christian, but not I think all religions are okay. That way I won't run into trouble. Like I'll be okay with my friends. Like that's not the best way to go. Like this is the way that I see it. I believe that everything that exists is in its proper place and in its proper light. It is a manifestation of the divine logos, and it has to be, or else it wouldn't exist. There's nothing which exists which is evil in itself. Okay? Everything that exists has to be a manifestation of the great pattern. There's no way around it. Okay? And so in that light, I think that I can look at other traditions and I can learn some things from them, but I always do it from the inside of where I am. And so I am a Christian and I hear a passage from Rumi and I think, hey, that's not bad. but I'm a Christian. I'm not standing in the nowhere zone of like weird universalism.
Right.
Because universalists think they stand above all the paths, and they can look at each one and say what they think of each of these paths. And they can go, well, I like this about Buddhism, and I like this about Christianity, and I like this about Hinduism. And they make themselves the gods in the world. But in the end, they're not going anywhere.
That's something that I've discovered lately. That there's a really good appeal, and it's enticing to kind of pick and choose and to like have a very broad overview. And I think there's some true value in that, but there's also some flaws, some that you pointed out, and also something that has became more aware as I gain more experience is that these things are so complicated that it's hard to even grasp one to make coherence. So it's a lifetime of trying to understand these things in fully. So if you're trying to understand all of them and you're trying to put that into a coherent new path, like you're not even walking anywhere, because not only because they have to cohere together, but also because your own understanding also comes from the very act of walking. And so if you're too worried about which one to walk, like you're never progressing.
Yeah, and it's more than that. It's actually more than that, because one of the things that happens in Christianity, or if you follow, let's say you engage in Christianity, you take the sacraments, you find a confessor, you do all that, like you're right in there and you're living the life. There are things that are going to be asked of you and things that you're going to encounter that you're not going to like, that you're just not going to like, and you're not going to understand, and will actually maybe frustrate you a little bit. But you know what? That's actually pretty good for you, because what happens if you stand above all religions and then you create your hodgepodge of all the different religions, you end up just taking whatever it is that you like in those religions. And then what happens is that you have nothing will make you grow. Like, how can you grow if if there's nothing to challenge you to something that you're not?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you see it, like you can see it. There's a church in California where there's a Universalist church where they put up all these saints painted up in the apse, like a frieze of saints kind of dancing together. And in that frieze of saints, they put everybody. It's like there's Gandhi and there's like Ella Fitzgerald, and there's some saints. There's like, Augustine is there and Origen is there. And but it's funny that, and so they're like, we're Universalists, we like everything and everything's good. And it's just funny because it's funny that all the people up in your saints frieze are still all the people you agree with.
Right.
So why if you're a Universalist and you think that everybody's going to be saved, then why is Hitler not up in your frieze?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why don't you put a little of some people that'll challenge, maybe not Hitler, but like put someone you don't like, at least like someone you don't like who's not as bad, but you need so that's the problem with this kind of standing above, and you can see it, like New Age religion is all that, like New Age religion,
the perfect
all
example.
that. It's just like porridge. It's horrible.
But it's funny because the example you gave is actually a perfect parallel to my philosophy journey, because I started learning on my own, but then I started to have like an intimation. Like, okay, we're living in the age of internet. You can learn a lot of stuff on your own, etc. But I just had the intimation that just picking and choosing what I wanted wasn't the best choice. And I decided to go to university and study philosophy more formally exactly because of that. Like, I don't want to have my own biased selection of what I like. So that's also, it's a perfect parallel with a more religious element as well, because you have your own biases. Like, you're just going to have your own little selection and you just ignore everything you disagree with. And that's not a good way to move forward.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of stuff that you're not going to have time. So I need to kind of crunch it a little bit. Okay, so you mentioned love. That's something I'm kind of trying to make it more clear in my head, and I find it's very interesting and useful. And so maybe you could touch a bit on love in a Christian sense, and especially on the aspect of both allowing the multiplicity, but also having a unified direction, and the struggle between the two that seems paradoxical.
Yeah, and that's really, I mean, I take my vision of love more from St. Maximus the Confessor especially, but it's exemplified it's exemplified ultimately in the doctrine of the Trinity itself, right? In the idea of God as being both one and three. The notion is that for reality to exist, there needs to be affordance for both unity and multiplicity, right? And so you need to have, let's say you need to have a chair, but then that chair, first of all, you need to leave space for that chair to be made up by different parts that aren't a chair, right? And then you need that chair to also be part of a whole of other things which aren't the chair. But all the parts of the chair have to commune together, and they need to manifest the unity of the chair, or else that chair is useless, right? If the parts of the chair don't manifest to you the unity of the chair, then you can't sit on it and it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Okay. And so the idea is that is the basic problem of reality, but it's also, you can say, the opportunity of reality. And that's really where you get the sense of love, which is that love is the capacity we have to be united with others, but also not to dissolve into others, right? Not to completely disappear and to lose our individual existence. So love preserves a kind of fractal pattern of reality, which is that you can have multiplicities at different levels and they join together in communion, but then they also participate in other multiplicities, and then that joins up. So you have a scaling up of reality. It's an ontological ladder, an ontological scale that happens. And then it reaches all the way and then is exemplified perfectly in the Trinity, which is even represented in a manner which looks like a contradiction, which is that it's perfectly one, perfectly many, perfectly three, without contradiction, but although it looks like an aporia and a contradiction, it's still the pattern of everything. Like it's objectively the pattern of everything. Like it's objectively how the world imperfectly then manifests itself to us as this relationship between one and many.
Right.
So that's what I think love is the communing with others, communing together without destroying our unique existence.
And how does love, because I've had this intimation in experiences that I've had, but it's very hard to articulate, which is there's like a pattern, a pattern of all patterns. There seems to be at the core like a self-referential looping thing, which from my understanding is kind of like, it's kind of to show how consciousness faces the world and interprets the world, and that's how things are created, even though that makes no sense from a modern view. But I'm curious about if you could explore a bit of that self-reference and that pattern of patterns, and how does that connect to love? Because that seems, I don't know, they seem related to me, but I don't quite understand how they're the same thing, because I can think of them differently. One is a more like categorical making of reality through categorization and how things appear, and the other one is the joining together, and it's especially how and also especially how it relates to Christ as well, because something that I've also struggled with is because we can talk about love in this philosophical sense that you've mentioned, but and that has an intimation to the love that we regularly experience with our partners or our family, and so that makes another dimension that I find it even hard to make everything coherent. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I don't know if I'm going to solve the whole problem, because this is really difficult stuff. But one of the things that can help you, let's say, understand is the idea that the reality resolves itself in a kind of contradiction, which isn't a contradiction, or a supreme contradiction. I don't know how else to say it, or something which is beyond logic. Logic flows out of a reality which is beyond logic. Okay, and so it's expressed in different manners. It can be expressed as divine darkness, for example, and the notion of the idea that divine darkness is being blinded by light. And so you're blinded by light. So light, instead of making you see things, it actually makes you blind. And that is an image of ultimate reality. So it's something which is kind of beyond light and dark, beyond the normal oppositions of logic. And you see that all the time in descriptions of God. You see it all the time. That's why the Trinity is also described in a way which seems contradictory. And it's described very much also in the reality of the incarnation. The reality of the incarnation is a reality which transcends logic, but does it in a way that you can intuit. It's not stupid. It's not like illogical in the normal sense. It rather transcends categories of logic by fusing things that are, let's say, opposites in a way that is difficult even to talk about, right? And you see that in the story of the crucifixion explicitly, where everything is both glory and death at the same time. Everything is both the highest and the lowest at the same time. And that is this kind of weird contradictory thing out of which the world flows, right? You can understand it like communion is it's hard to talk about this stuff because you can only talk about it in imagistic form.
Right.
And so let's say we talk about communion. So communion is a lot of things. It's this common meal we take together. It's also a meal which comes from above. So it's kind of like this authority which is giving us food. And so we participate together in communing together in church, but we also access that which is above us as the authority kind of gives us this food and lifts us up into his, let's say, authority. All of that is happening, but communion is also like the eating of the body and blood of a divine man, but it's also not that, because it's bread and wine also. And so that's the type of thing where all of a sudden, and so you have something which is the place where we all come together, where we all join together. But there's an aspect of it which is like, it's cannibalism. It's an aspect of it which is the self-eating. That's what cannibalism is. It's self-eating. That's the impossible self-contradictory loop at the beginning of reality.
That will be a mouthful.
I think you'll have enough to think about now.
and I'm especially feeling bad for people who aren't even aware of your work at all.
Well, maybe, yeah. So we'll see how people react to this conversation. It'll be interesting, and we'll see.
So something that I'm curious, and maybe you don't have to go very in depth into this because you're short on time, but I consider my worldview not 100%, but decently overlapping with John Rovecki, for example. And I'm curious about, from your Christian perspective, what is that worldview missing? Because it's not the typical materialist view at all. Like, it recognizes the symbolic structure of reality, the importance of narrative and all those things. But I'm pretty sure that there's still a decently sized gap between my worldview and your review. So what do you think I'm missing? What don't I understand?
Yeah. No, as you know, I really appreciate John, and I really appreciate the work he's doing, and I feel like much of what he's doing is very helpful to secular people to understand what is this stuff about, like what are we talking about, because religious people sometimes have their internal language, and then it's difficult sometimes to pierce it. And so I appreciate that a lot. I think that John has the same problem as a lot of the modern kind of religious tropes, is that he sees the danger of fully committing, let's say, to a story and embodying and participating in the story. And because of that, he doesn't want to do it. And he thinks that it's dangerous to do that. And so he has a post-narrative spirituality, which doesn't require any type of, let's say, commitment or what we would call faith in kind of common parlance, but rather is a series of practices, right? Is a what do you call it? An ecology of practices. And the thing is that I think that it can be helpful. The things that he's doing can be helpful to help people wake up and to help them understand, and to help them improve some aspects of their lives. But in the end, I think that we also need communion, and we need to commune together, and we need to cohere. And that happens in common, let's say, common story, common creed. All of these things are how we also cohere together. And I think that, and ultimately what I also think is that without that, at some point, you're just going to get eaten by the other fish.
Right.
Like if you don't have a story and you don't engage in a story, then those who are will come and they'll just take your thing from you.
Uh-huh. So something that helped me commit more was, let's call them SME, mystical experiences. And actually, this is a topic that I wanted to bring up, but then I ended up watching your recent video with a Romanian guy. I can't remember his name. Yeah. But you actually spoke of mysticism towards the end, or mystical experiences, sorry. And I was actually a bit surprised by your approach to it, or rather your view on it, which seemed decently positive. And I don't want to fall into the trap of chasing a mystical experience, and people in a variety of traditions have kind of advised against it because it's complicated and it can be disorienting, and it can lead you astray for sure. But it can also be very helpful. And I'm curious but you, just for people that haven't watched the video, so what I gathered is that you thought that a mystical experience can be good in the sense that if it doesn't lead you astray, and if it helps your life, if it helps your community, if it helps your understanding of the sacred. And so that's what I gathered as your general view. Is that correct, or I'm kind of jumping?
Yeah, I would say it can be helpful, but you have to not see it as a goal, and not see it as something that has value in itself. And so I think that's usually where people go astray, is when they think that the mystical experience is all, and that that's what they're looking for, and that they also attach themselves to those who have mystical experiences, as if having a mystical experience is somehow a sign of virtue, which it isn't necessarily. And so I think that, but you can't deny that mystical experiences are part of the tradition. And there are plenty of saints that have had mystical experiences and mystical visions, and all of that is all part of the tradition. You just have to not get too attached to them.
And I'm curious, assuming that one has a responsible and holistic view of a mystical experience, in the context of the ascent of the mountain within a coherent religious structure. So let's say that you're not like the new age idiot, let's say. So let's take that for granted. So even in that context of a mystical experience, would you still view that has a potentially positive role, even if it's aided by psychedelics, which is not the typical experience of Christian mystics throughout the ages?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't take psychedelics, and so I don't see it talked about. I don't know if it's somewhere in the Church Fathers someone talks about it. I've never seen it, and so I don't really know. One thing for sure is that I feel like psychedelics, they're like an easy way out, or an easy way in, you could say. And so,
I think that's more appropriate.
yeah, and so my understanding is, my experience of people who have taken a lot of psychedelics is that they have prelest, like they have they have a kind of spiritual pride, which is they think that they have some insight because of their experience that other people don't have. But it's not always, but I have experienced that. I have seen that. But my experience is that I really haven't felt like people who take psychedelics have more insight. I mean, there's some people I met who have taken psychedelics who do have insight, and there are some people who have taken psychedelics who obviously don't have insight. And there's something about it. There's something about talking about an experience you had that is so insanely amazing, but that you can't bring anything back from it. It's like, I'm suspicious about all that stuff. So I don't know. I would say that in general, any form of mystical life that you want to lead should be done with a guide, should be done with someone who can help you, whether it's in a Christian tradition or anywhere else. In the Christian tradition, if you want to take up a kind of mystical path, the literature warns you very explicitly not to do it. Like they say, don't do that. It's dangerous if you don't have someone to guide you. And so I would say even more so with something like psychedelics, because people just take them and then they're like left on their own with their like weird experiences. And it's also because you have to also, it's hard not to see the role that psychedelics have played in the breakdown of the modern world. Mm-hmm. You can't completely ignore that. And I think maybe this is the first time I say this, but it's like, if you look at the relationship between the psychedelic and the 60s and psychedelics and a kind of breakdown of cohesion in society, there is definitely a link there. Mm-hmm. I think there is. And so there's something about people who take psychedelics a lot, not all, but when you listen to like the gurus, like, the ones I'm talking about,
yeah,
the way they talk, they really have a dangerous, they really have dissolution on their mind. I think they really have a kind of breakdown on their mind. Mm-hmm. And anyway, that's my 2 cents about that. But
right,
like I said, I've never tried it, so I don't know.
Uh-huh. Well, I agree with some of you said, and then this could go on forever. I actually didn't want to talk about psychedelics because I've talked a fair bit on it on my podcast with other hosts. But seeing your views on mysticism kind of made me curious, and I kind of broke my own plan. So I just want to have one last question, and then I'll let you go. All right,
because I do need to go actually. So cool. Go ahead. Last question, then
super quick. So you do a lot of movie interpretations, and I think that's really helpful to kind of see the patterns, and that's it's really hard to understand them without a concrete example. And so your movie interpretations are incredibly helpful, and I recommend people to watch them. So I would like you to give a recommendation of what you think is the most symbolic movie you can think of, and maybe also a novel.
I really can't answer that question.
I'll make it easier. Give me a really good one. Doesn't have to be the best.
A movie that has good symbolism in it. There are plenty of movies that have good symbolism in it. I mean, there are plenty of like popular movies. I feel like a lot of the popular movies have good symbolism. I don't know which one. Like, I feel like Miyazaki's movies are amazing. Those are some of the movies that I enjoy the most in terms of their use of symbolism in a positive light, I would say. I did an interpretation of Spirited Away, is a movie that I really, really, really liked in terms of symbolism. So maybe that one. Spirited Away is a great movie.
Cool. Perfect. Do you have a novel on top of your head?
A novel? In terms of symbolism?
Yeah.
I feel like, no, I always tell people to read Dostoevsky. I mean, just because of right now, it seems like a good time to read Dostoevsky, just because his understanding of the world is so profound and is so helpful to seeing what's going on right now. And so I would say that people should read The Devils right now. It's hard to read though, but it's worth it.
Dostoevsky is brilliant. I just finished the Notes from Underground a few days ago, and I'm still trying to process.
That was hard, man. It leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth because it's so dark.
Yeah, it's dark, but it's rewarding. Okay, so thank you so much. Like this is super fun. And continue good work. Like I really appreciate it. It has helped me immensely, and I know it helps a lot of other people as well.
All right, send me a link of this when you put it up.
Yep, I will. Thank you.
It's good to talk to you, Thiago. Bye-bye.